Okay, thank you.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, thank you very much. So welcome to everybody in the room who've joined us again, and to those of you online. You're very welcome back to our Imagined Geographies symposium, past and future. Can I also ask those of you who are in the room, before you leave, there's on the table by the door, there's actually a sheet. If you would just sign your name so we know that you have been here. Your name should already be on the sheet, but just to confirm you've been here, that would be really helpful. So we now come to part of the symposium where we have the delight and of hearing an expert speak about place. And this expert is someone who has got quite the reputation both in area studies internationally and as a Russianist, as a scholar of the East. And her name is, as you will have seen according to our programme, Professor Edith W. Clowes. She is a Brown-Forman Professor from the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Virginia in the United States. And she has just very recently, in the last week or so, published her new book called Shredding the Map, Imagined Geographies of Revolutionary Russia. And it was with Edith's contact with me saying that she had written this book and what it was about, which made us think that this would be a very interesting theme. Interesting both for global development, area studies, and the East Centre, our 3 research centres in the University of East Anglia, that we decided to organise these seminars and the call for papers. And Edith's book speaks directly to the issues of place consciousness and indeed to wider notions of place-based identity. And we will be exploring these in many different ways over the next 2 days. And her work is receiving a lot of attention, obviously because of the kind of context in which it has been written and her insights into notions of history of the East and what is happening in wider Europe at the moment. We're very pleased to have Edith with us at UEA. We look forward to what we know, because I've heard it before, will be a fascinating and informative presentation about her recent work. And we invite her now to speak about Shredding the Map, Imagined Geographies of the Western Steppe in War, Revolution and Putin's Special Operation. Thank you, Edith.
Thank you for that introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm honored that you named this conference after a concept that I imagined myself, but building on other people, of course, as we all do. And I just want to thank all the organizers, because this is just a lot of work and a magnificent event. Did everybody get a handout? Okay, good. A 2012 special report on technology and geography in The Economist highlights the death of geography through the ubiquity of the internet and the view that people can be in touch anywhere. It does not matter where they are. In contrast, another argument could be made that technology also encourages thinking about imagined geographies, just as in another age, the spread of newspaper journalism encouraged the growth of imagined communities. For us, of course, Google Maps and Google Earth have made people much more aware of both physical and imagined geography. And technology has enabled investigation of imagined geographies on a scale significantly larger than the traditional close reading of texts that we literature scholars have traditionally done. Today, I want to explore the proposition that for all the flattening impact of computer technology and the internet, geography and imagined geography are inescapable in a situation in which people must be on the ground, which is where most of us live, of course, we hope, and in place. Geography Matters and Imagined Geography, how we attach emotionally and mentally to space and how we make space into our own place, all that matters very much, frankly, as it always has. I think we're just more conscious of it now, maybe because the Earth is shrinking. I'm talking about, though, specifically war in general and Russia's current war against Ukraine in particular. Today, we will focus on a part of the world's geography that might seem so dull as not to merit attention. I have in mind the steppe, the broad plains of Eastern Europe. For many years in the early 2000s, I personally lived and worked on the US Great Plains, typically seen as snarkily called flyover country by those who live on the US coasts. This land has its own dramatic skies and easy rolling terrain, and they have of an impressive, if not always comfortable, beauty. As I learned, the history of bleeding Kansas, where I lived, was all about the Civil War struggle between abolitionists and slave owners in the 19th century and red and blue factions in the 21st century. I was happy in these contested lands. I think I like a good fight, actually. And I decidedly found my place there very much because of this imagined geography that connects physical terrain to stories of sacrifice and liberation. And as I learned, Ukrainian visitors to the University of Kansas, where I was working at the time, love visiting the North American plains, in part because they recognize themselves in that landscape. Whatever the similarities, the political and cultural contrasts between the North American prairie and the Eurasian steppe are remarkable. The North American prairie lies on a north-south axis, and the Eurasian steppe on an east-west axis. The prairie has decided meaning as indigenous territory ravaged by the spread of Europeans westward. Wars have been fought throughout the plains, and today presidencies are won and lost over the political problems on our southern border, also the prairie. For that, compared to steppe history, the geopolitics of the North American plains looks almost peaceful, and for global history, possibly less important. The steppe, in contrast, has major geopolitical importance for the history of Eurasia and for our focus today for Russia and Ukraine. The steppe, briefly, is a borderless expanse of territory across which it is simple to cross thousands of kilometers relatively unhindered. Linguists and archaeologists have posited the Western steppe as the birthplace of European peoples and language groups. In more recent East Slavic history, the steppe has functioned as what I call the great East-West superhighway. Its sheer liminality, its essence as a road to somewhere else, means that the people who live there can and have been crushed from century to century. That very boundlessness of the steppe has been a deciding factor in Russian and Ukrainian histories and has garnered heartfelt expressions in both cultures, suggesting that the figure of the steppe is crucial to both identities. So literature can be a major purveyor of social and political identity. And here's my question, though. Why should we pay attention to imagined Russian and Ukrainian visions of the steppe expressed in the arts, especially at this time of very hot war? The war is happening precisely on the steppe and being fought most obviously over resources and political power. It's also being fought, though, for what I call geo-emotional reasons, driven by age-old sense of belonging, but also age-old anxieties. As always, having a media voice serves essential ideological purposes, but also divulges personal perceptions that are shared by an audience, however large that audience may be, and they tend to carry considerable weight. Particularly important in both cultures are the voices embedded in imaginative writing, published writing, whether essays, novels, poetry, or songs. So before considering the significance of the imagined steppe, a bit more geohistorical background will be helpful. The terrain now defined by the Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kherson regions was for millennia the homeland of nomadic tribes. The first European-oriented East Slavic state on this terrain took shape in the 10th century around the city of Kiev. The city was flattened by the Mongols in the 13th century, and then subsequently in the 15th century, revitalized as a Polish-Lithuanian-controlled city, eventually boasting a major academy, which by the 18th century would provide scholars actually to the Imperial Russian court in St. Petersburg. The steppe became a vast border zone between Poland, Moscow, and the Ottoman Empire. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Muscovite rulers called the steppe the wild field, settled by runaway serfs and nobles, as well as Tatars and Turks. A network of self-sufficient military agricultural Cossack villages emerged along the banks of major rivers, which in the 17th century grew into a Cossack state, subsequently led by a hetman and called the hetmanate. Here's a map. The hetmanate always had to negotiate for the very existence between those three powerful neighboring empires. Eventually co-opted into the imperial Russian state, Cossack communities across the steppe policed the imperial borders and brutally crushed various ethnic groups, most famously Jews, but others as well, in the name of the Tsar. Under the Tsarist Empire, Ukraine became known as a form of Russia, Little Russia, as opposed to Great Russia. Specifically, the steppe portion, where fighting now continues, was renamed New Russia or Novorossiya in the late 18th century under Catherine II. Subsequently, right up to the revolution, all Eastern Slavs were counted by the Tsarist government as Russians without any adjectival modifiers. So here's a map from 1912, just before World War I. The first modern, very unstable attempt at an independent state, the Ukrainian National Republic, was declared in January 1918 and divided by the new Soviet Union and the newly independent Poland in March of 1921. And by 1921, despite the fact that the Soviet Ukrainian Republic was established as one of the 15 Soviet socialist republics, one of its resource-rich provinces, Donetsk, where so much fighting is going on, was still being represented as Russian. And here's a poster from 1921. So Russians have always claimed this area, even though today it's Ukraine. And in the Soviet era, it was Ukraine. Since the 18th century, the population of resource-rich Donetsk has been Russianized in several waves. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Russian peasants moved to Donetsk to work in the coal mines. Under Stalin, well over 500,000 Ukrainians were deported, and at least 3 million Ukrainians starved to death in the Holodomor of 1932-33. After World War II, Eastern Donetsk and Luhansk regions were repopulated, mainly with ethnic Russians. Cultural reforms also banned Ukrainian instruction in the schools. Since 1991 and the formal recognition of Ukraine as a country completely separate from Russia, there have been several efforts on the part of Russian rulers to suppress Ukrainian governance. And as we know, the war of the last 10 to 11 and probably beyond years is by far the longest lived. Particularly since February 2022, a Ukrainian sense of nationality among both Ukrainian and Russian speakers in Ukraine has strongly solidified. Ukrainian Imagined Geography, which includes both mental conceptualization and emotional attitude, have all played an important role in this process. Contrasting Russian and Ukrainian writing cultures that focus on geographical settings and locations allow us to move beyond the political leaders' particular visions of what Russia should be, or Ukraine for that matter, particularly poetry, fiction, essay writing, and the rest, and web posts now too, give credible personal perceptions of geographical place. And these contrasts actually between Russian and Ukraine are quite stark. For example, even in the 19th century, Russia's important dictionary by Vladimir Dal pictures the steppe as treeless, often waterless, unsettled wasteland in which nomads roam. I mean, which didn't really relate to the to the 19th century. Clearly, this definition conveys a relatively alienated view. Ukrainians, as we will see, traditionally embrace the steppe as homeland. As benchmarks for today's expressions, we will consider Russian imagined geography during the revolution and civil wars of 100 years ago through my Russia-oriented mapper database project, and one or two iconic Ukrainian expressions of imagined geography. So it's something, we'll start with Ukraine and their traditional expressions. It's something of a cliche to say that Ukrainians identify with the steppe. Possibly the most famous expression is by Ukraine's leading poet of the 19th century, Taras Shevchenko. Shevchenko's poem, My Testament, was written in 1845 as an expression of the rise of Ukrainian national consciousness. Shortly after, Shevchenko was sent to prison for writing in Ukrainian. So on your handout and the slide here, he writes, and I'm going to cut back a little bit on what I read just because of time and because you've got the slides and the handouts. When I'm dead, bury me in my beloved Ukraine, my tomb upon a grave mound high, and the spreading plain, the fields, and boundless steppes. In popular political lore, the by now very familiar Ukrainian flag gives much more indication of broad national identification with the steppe. Designed in 1918 and reestablished in 1991, the flag features a thick blue stripe, the broad sky, over a thick yellow stripe, symbolizing the steppe with its vast grain fields. In this official symbolism, Ukrainians indeed do embrace the steppe as their home. The Russian benchmark is much more complicated. It derives from my database, the Mapping Imagined Geographies of Revolutionary Russia, and my new book, Shredding the Map. The Mapper database allows us to graph war and revolutionary era imagined geography of Russian language writers. The database assembles a sizable body, about 650 works of place-oriented writing produced exactly 100 years before this current war in Ukraine, spanning 1914 to 1922. And Russians love these temporal sort of signposts, so it gives me the willies to think about this. I think it is really not by chance. The idea of shredding a map comes from a Bolshevik poem that celebrates crumpling the map to make the world anew, build a new world. Whereas I find shredding the map is more fearsome in a way. Mapper gives us a strong evidence of Russian imagined geographical patterns that, as I claim, persist today. The Russian literary geoemotional perceptions of the steppe, even during revolutionary years, show very stark contrast between strong hopes and very strong fears associated with the steppe region. So I'm going to show you just 3 graphs that may or may not mean much. I mean, they're what I call my bubbles and threads. They're just, but if you go on site and look under what is it called? Analytics, you can make your own graphs, and they're fun to play with. So here shows the yellow framed purple dots show the foregrounding of Soviet Russia, new country, faith in the resurrected Messiah, very strange but interesting, jubilation, hope, and solidarity. The next one shows anxiety-arousing liminal space, also from the same time, from literary texts that have been tagged to show the connection between place and emotion and political valence. And these are full of threat and danger. And what you can notice if you actually go build it yourself, because you probably can't see it that well here, uncanny home, empty space, road, and front. So liminal spaces that are worrisome. And then the third slide shows all the writers, sorry, who connect with steppe. And then I also put in here, even though there are fewer connections, wasteland, plain, and flatland. And what you can notice there is that there are an awful lot of Russian writers who invoke the steppe, with various feelings associated. So we see a very remarkable contrast between feelings of faith and hope, and on one hand, in the center column, and feelings of despair and dread. A map or poem by the canonical Russian peasant writer Sergei Yesenin helps us to ground the impressions produced by graphing these expressions of the steppe. Yesenin himself hailed from the steppe region in the south of Russia, not far from eastern Ukraine. His 1916 poem conveys the complex of feeling that we've just found. It starts with a deep adoration of the nocturnal landscape, only to subvert it with even deeper dread. And I'm just going to skip along to the shift in the landscape later in the poem, as the poet exposes the anxiety that the limitless steppe calls forth. And he says, "O land of feathergrass, your flatness is close to my heart, but in your thickets is hidden salt marsh yearning. And like me, you are in sad need. You've forgotten who's a friend and who a foe." One becomes disoriented in the steppe. This poem epitomizes that crucial Russian balance of deep affection and just as deep alienation and even fear. So how does that set of feelings reverberate now? So Russia's war against Ukraine is most obviously about punishing Ukrainians for resisting Moscow's overlordship, refusing to be a Russian client state, and establishing independent governance. And it's about securing access to material resources, coal and other things, and control of ports in the Black Sea region. Perhaps most significantly, however, this war is about securing Russia's border with Europe, which has over 200 years been really a buffer zone rather than a border, a hard border at least. Since 2014, Russians have been writing about Putin's early occupation of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk in 2014, and in 2022, his full-bore invasion of Ukraine. These poems and posts divulge a similarly complex geo-emotional condition, though also complicated by propagandistic bombast that has been strongly supported by the Putin regime. Posts by soldiers at the front convey alienation and wariness, to start with. These soldiers, not surprisingly, view the steppe mainly as liminal space, sort of monotonous, borderless battle zone filled with danger to themselves. And I'm just going to give one example here. The Russian soldier Danila comments that the steppe is dangerous because armored vehicles are sitting ducks for anti-tank guided missiles. In theory, technology should carry us well beyond the enemy's position. But in fact, over there, in the fields, the steppe is filled with anti-tank missiles destroying everything. The enemy is over there somewhere in the bushes with their laser-guided anti-tank missiles, so we get out and walk to the battle site. This and other comments from the field convey not just, not just boredom, but more importantly, frustration mixed with a high level of anxiety and dread. Russians think they should be winning, and yet they're having a tough time gaining ground, except for with an asterisk, because right now they're gaining way too much ground. In contrast, the mood and imagined geography of rearguard Russian poetry is a carbon copy of Tsarist patriotism of the World War I period that I tagged. It's filled with abstract geographical vocabulary. So I'll just read this briefly. Our sons volunteer and set forth. The Donbass is on fire. My soul is torn to threads. Anxiety creeps into my dreams, and so forth. But since our country calls, so we fight for our motherland, Russia and Donbass. Again, this poetry claims Donbass as Russian. Overwrought purple verse passionately hails Russia, nation, homeland, along with the assumption that Donetsk belongs to Russia. So far, Russian quote-unquote patriots who call Donetsk home appear to be quite silent. In their place, though, the Putin government does support several propagandists who claim to be Donbass writers, which I found quite interesting. So, for example, the site Culture House Rossiya claims that the poems cited here, in my paper at least, were written by Donbass writers. And here's one example. These Russian language propagandists standing in as Donbass writers hope to convey more passion and a stronger emotional connection to steppe and field as their purported home, which of course is only a facade. So this example, Sergei Kargashin, is a Russian poet hailing from the north, the Kaliningrad region on the Baltic Sea. His poem asserts pride in being Russian and being from the southern steppe. He says, I'm Russian, thank the Lord, I'm the field, grandmother's grave, I am the cottages of the Ryazan region, which isn't Ukraine, I am the sky's deep blue, the neighboring woods, etc., etc. And he says further, like a fortress above the abyss, Russia has stood and will continue to stand. Kargashin identifies as Russian through images of the fields in Ryazan, but this site claims him as a Donbass writer. Okay, there's another slide that I think I'm going to skip that is also interesting by a well-known blogger and propagandist, and you can read that. It's also full of braggadocio. Not surprisingly, ordinary Russians who live on the southern Russian steppe have much more nuanced feelings toward their place. One example I'll describe here, and the other I'll leave till the end of my talk. The statistically completely insignificant, but nonetheless suggestive Russian language poll of ordinary people in the Russian steppe, it was done in August of 2024, just so a couple of months ago, asked about their mental and emotional associations with the word steppe. So several mention wide open expanses of the steppe and freedom, what you might expect. Emotions expressed range from joy and love here to sadness and dread, that same old pattern. Cultural associations include images of the ancient Scythian steppe horse culture, which is very freeing, and then popular songs, which are quite a bit sadder and actually about death often. The song, Oh You Broad Steppe, is about the steppe further east near the Volga River and its dangers. The 1860s song, Steppe, Steppe All Around, is an extremely popular song, even today, about the death of a coachman in the steppe. These songs definitely convey the danger and even deathliness of the boundless steppe, which isn't exactly hopeful. So Russians are a little nervous about that steppe region. I can say much more about historically how they've addressed that if you want to later. Contemporary wartime Ukrainians, now we turn to the Ukrainians, do not necessarily foreground the steppe as home. And this is interesting too. Some focus on the forest and most focus on the cities. It's an urbanized culture now. And the pain of losing life and terrain. Still, the steppe does loom large as a site. The Odessa psychologist and poet, Boris Khersonsky, answers Shevchenko's romantic nationalist poem featuring the steppe in a bitter parody. When I die, don't let me rest, buried in a grave. Let the waves of fire carry me up to the sky. This poem, while geographically aware, refuses to call any place home. The steppe is the implied terrain that Khersonsky avoids mentioning, but is clearly mourning. Several works do express a much stronger and, frankly, in my view, artistically more talented sense of home in the steppe lands and throughout Ukraine. That strong attachment is conveyed in geographical imagery carries with it a powerful emotions that bode well for Ukraine's, I hope, in this war. They're defending their emotional homeland as well as their physical terrain. The war has inflicted enormous pain as homeland has become a battle zone. Place is not forgotten, but functionally has become liminal space. Nonetheless, there's little to none of the dread that marks Russian imagined geography of the steppe. Both embracing the steppe and watching it become a liminal battle zone feature in several works, and I'll just give one example now. This example comes from the soldier poet Vasil Holoborodko, it's a mouthful, who is a miner from Luhansk who started to publish poetry at the end of the Soviet regime after being banned for decades. In his poem from the early years of the Russian invasion, it's called I Pick Up My Footprints, and the steppe here is clearly home where the lyrical persona lives and moves. It is not liminal. And I think I put most of the poem in the handout. I stoop to pick up my footprints. Someone seeing me might think I'm gathering mushrooms, healing herbs, or flowers into a bunch. But no, I collect my footprints by traces everywhere. I walked for many years. Here are the footprints I left while herding sheep on the steppe. Here I took the path to school, and these are my steps from my route to work. Home, however, has become a vexed mental place found only in poetry and in books that does not lead back to physical geographical home. So he ends with, if I put them all in one row, so all the steps in one row, their path wouldn't lead me home. Holoborodko cherishes his bucolic steppe home with its sheep and cherry tree, but feels that the traces of it left in his poetry are not the same as home. Poetry itself gives voice, but it does not return one to one's home. Okay, skipping a couple pages here. So two poems from one from each side of the border promote the steppe, and I'm getting here toward the end, as a place shared by both peoples, Russians and Ukrainians. One emphasizes its liminal quality as battle zone, while the other nostalgically portrays a time when everyone got along. The first, by Mikhail Son, a Russian language marine biologist from Odessa, pictures a Russian recruit, either mistakenly or on false pretexts, sent to fight in the Ukrainian steppe. And this guy suffers from asthma, and so he shouldn't be fighting. And I really sympathize with this Russian recruit. But I'll just quote from the middle, which, okay, that's another one. From the middle of the poem that refers to the steppe. The steppe, riddled with bullets, will not grow feather grass. The rain washes clean skulls and weapons. Here's the Red Army lying underneath and the infrared armies of ancient days. One's dug down much deeper, or buried much deeper. Commissar and lieutenant, ataman and cornet, all slashed at the mists and shot into the dawn. Who can tell now where enemies are and where friends? The front family is joined at the backbone. So while he's echoing Yesenin in a way, he's finding a reason to join. All right. The steppe here is an ancient battle zone that's seen many, many wars. And for the Russian language Ukrainian, although it implicitly condemns the Russian state for mistreating its soldiers, it's also true that this steppe zone, as liminal and transitional as it is, evokes confusing feelings for the front family, who might take different sides, but are still joined at the hip. In contrast, the interaction between ordinary Russians and Ukrainians turns into criticism of Russians' bad feeling in another poem. This voice comes surprisingly from Kursk, recently invaded from Ukraine by Ukrainians. It offers a bright vision of sort of, can we just get along? We've always lived here. We can all get along. Strongly aware of the Ukraine-Russian border, it's called I Was Born by the Border. And it's by the young Russian poet Angelina Lesnaya from Kurchatov, who wishes for lost transborder peace. So she says, I was born by the border, the frontier is just beyond the hill. A nasty tongue tries to call me a spy, because she's sympathetic to both sides. You're a Ukrainian, nothing more, the wit grins. Indeed, at the dacha, I plant beets to make borscht. And what's different here, and you have to know read the Russian text, she is dotting different kinds of food and different people. She's using Ukrainian words. So it's kind of a mix of Ukrainian and Russian, which is very fitting. And then she writes further, here, half the names have a ko suffix, so Ukrainian. Across the field, so steppe, right, lies Ukraine. It's easy to go across. Forever, our speech has had the local che and sho, and encounters were heartfelt. We lived well, written in caps. And then she says, through me flourish the roots of two cultures, which draw attention, the attention of vigilant authorities. Please, Captain, be so good as to understand my nature. On both sides of the border, people suffer double the pain. Images of border and field in the poem imply the flat land of the steppe, or just sort of rolling land of the steppe. Yasnaya uses Ukrainian words in her poem, as I just said, to stress the closeness of the two border languages and cultures, and insists that in earlier times people got along just fine. I mean, that's imagined, but she hopes usable history. So in conclusion, current Russian war writing is mouthing old, strangely bombastic and abstracted patriotic imagery of Tsarist Russia. In strong contrast, Ukrainian writing is full of fresh passion, born by vibrant geographical imagery. In contrast to Russian Imagined Geography, in his brand new book, The Language of War, that just was translated, Ukrainian soldier-writer Alexander Mikhed reclaims the steppe as he anticipates the day of victory and what he will do on that day. And I'm going to read this little section. I know what I will do on the day of our victory. I will go out onto a wide road running between the fields. High skies, an amazing landscape before me. My body will be shaking. Somewhere inside my chest, growling and howling will begin and then grow into a scream, end quote. Mikhed will howl in mourning for all the lives lost. I find this anticipated moment and the landscape just really moving, but also curious, since overall Mikhed himself hails from the north and identifies much more with forest and city than he does with the steppe. All the same, by walking out onto the broad road into the fields, he's reclaiming the steppe as that national, quote unquote, home of Ukrainians. And he is establishing himself as one of its spokespeople. The Russian steppe anxiety is not going to go away and is clearly an underlying force, both driving Russian leaders to shore up their southwestern flank as they see it, but also working against them. Perhaps now, if there would ever be a Ukrainian victory, could the steppe become a throughway, bringing stronger practice of civil social rights and governance to authoritarian Russia? 100 years ago, in the minds of many Russian writers, Russia as home shattered into the shards of Russia as liminal space in the turmoil of civil war. And now, a century later, many hundreds of thousands of Russians have actually fled because of the threat of incarceration. So for them, Russia has become something that I call uncanny home. It's both alien and deeply familiar. In closing, nearly 200 years ago, in the 1820s and 30s, the Russian philosopher Pyotr Chadayev famously labeled Russia as the stepchild of Europe, and I'm going to allow myself a really bad pun, so I apologize. He meant that Russian culture, such as it was derivative, Russia, in his view, was an empty vessel with no culture of its own, borrowing from various European sources. 200 years later, Russia has now started and is continuing a brutal war geographically located on the Western Steppe, now against European ideas of civil society and sort of what we call democratic governance. Russia is the new barbarian on the steppe. Pardon the very bad pun, but this Russian government is showing itself to be both the stepchild of humanity in Cha'adayev's sense, but also the stepchild, an orphan set on what is perceived as an empty, threatening, dreadful liminal zone. Imagined geography, as well as historical experience, has moved the Putin government to undermine Ukrainians' efforts to form their own genuinely democratic country, and to fight all the corruption that has come with in the post-Soviet sphere. Against all expectations, not only is Russia shredding the map of Europe, but it's strengthening Ukrainians' national identity, quite separate from the neo-imperialist Russian one. And I thank you.
So we may have some questions in the room, or perhaps coming in online. Sure. Tom will have a look at those. So are there any questions? We've just got a few minutes before our break for lunch. I'm sure that there was quite a lot of different thoughts were going through people's heads as Edith was speaking earlier on.
Yeah,
so
it's many people.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Can you hear? It's many people's, so it's not your comfort zone here. So
yeah, I apologize because I'm an alumna. Thanks, so I'm a student of international relations. So apologies if this is just coming from ignorance. So I was curious about the role and the experience of Russians outside of Russia, and how are they feeling? Are they feeling alienated from Russia itself because geographically they are outside of it, and also because you have seen Russia itself changing under Putin's leadership, and that it's becoming, in many ways, a much less harder country to identify with for some people? So what's happening to those Russians outside of Russia?
that's a really good question. And it's something that I spent quite a bit of time just at least starting to research, but there wasn't time here. But they're in this kind of in-between zone where they tend, the ones that I read, and this is on a news site called Medusa, that they tend to be very sort of empathetic with and sympathetic with Ukraine, but they are also very just painfully aware that they're Russian voices and that they really don't have a right to speak in some sense, even though they do speak. And I think they should speak, because that just adds weight, in favor of the Ukrainian cause. But I think they're strongly alienated to sort of the Russia that Putin has created with his new police state, and his complete suppression of real sort of political competition within the Russian sphere. So it's a complicated situation as far as I've researched it, and I will continue to pay attention, but that's what I've found so far. Thank you for the question.
Francis?
Thank you. Fascinating. That's my observation. Just my observation really about imagined geographies and the imagined geography of Russia. I don't believe that any Russians in the 1980s, that sort of thing, imagined Russia as the territory of the Russian Federation. That simply was not their imagined homeland. The Russia they imagined, okay, it was different from the Soviet Union. It probably didn't include most of Central Asia or whatever, but it was, Ukraine, certainly the eastern parts of Ukraine were not seen as in any way foreign. you went from Moscow to Kiev, you weren't going abroad. And I think an important part of trying to make sense of what happens is the fact that suddenly the Russian nation has found itself split up between all sorts of states, many of whose political leaderships have been trying to define their own nations in opposition to contrast from Russia. And how the hell you deal with that, I don't know. But when people are talking about if a Ukrainian nationalist refers to Russia, they're thinking of the Russian Federation, the bit to the east and north of the borders of 1991. A Russian just doesn't see it like that.
So I'm not sure exactly whether there was a question or it was more of a comment, but an observation. And you're 110% correct. And there are all of these kind of fifth column communities in bordering states and even not bordering states. I mean, in Tashkent, there's a considerable Russian community and so forth. And they tend to identify with Russia. I mean, Estonia, we know, too. And, we've had this experience in the United States with monuments and tearing down monuments that sort of hail and in some sense celebrate the Confederacy. And there are some famous instances of tearing down statues in Estonia and Ukraine and so forth, in which that Russian fifth column just protested like crazy. And after World War II, for example, the Czechs went after the German fifth column and really were brutal in the final years of the years following 1945. No one's done that yet, but and Russia has taken, obviously, they've become the aggressor in Georgia and in Ukraine, in places that aren't NATO protected, so to speak. And I don't think they would invade Estonia and chip off pieces of Estonia the way they have in Georgia and Ukraine, because of the muscle that's behind NATO. So, I'm not sure where else to go with this, but you're completely right that there's an enormous sort of identity problem, and Russians, as oppressed as they felt by the Soviet sort of Union, they would also go to these places or move to those places, and Kazakhstan and so forth, and settle in and feel sort of semi-superior, right? They were the first among all these oppressed nationalities. I'm using oppressed in sort of parenthetically, but so it's very complicated. I mean, identity politics are complicated. So,
another question is here.
It's possibly a comment rather than a question, but I was really struck by your pun, or your play on words on Steppe, and I've been thinking a lot about it recently. This does have a point, via Kamala Harris, right, as a stepmother, and I'm a stepmother, I'm a stepchild, I'm a stepsister, and I want to write something at some point about stepness, and I'm wondering if a way to kind of thicken that idea in the kind of literary aspect of your work is to think about Steppe as precisely as an imagined relationship, right? Like, it's a relationship you have to will into being, you have to make it happen because that bond of blood isn't there, right? Your stepchildren are not compelled to like you. Mine do, happily, but yeah, so I liked the pun, but I want to kind of push on it and kind of expand it a little more, because I think you can do some really fruitful things there about kind of imagined communities and kind of the relationships that we will into being.
I mean, that's a great idea. And this was a little toe in the water with that pun. But I may jump in, whole body because there is a lot to explore. And one of my worries about this war is that it's particularly brutal because Putin calls it a special operation. He doesn't call it a war, and you can be imprisoned for 15 years for calling it a war. That's sort of not wonderful if you're in Russia. And so it's obviously not an international war in some sense, even though it's an international war. And our Ukrainians are the sort of sisters and brothers of Russia. Are they really connected at the hip? So then that makes it a civil war. And so there's this contested nature that, like, what's our kinship relationship? Which is exactly what you're going for. And I think it lets me open that up a bit more. And I may in the future, because that's been one of my just things that gnaw at me that I think also make this war particularly brutal.
There's a question on that.
Maria, could you tell us what it is?
So I'll read it out.
Yeah.
Does
So you're straight to Malcolm Gaston.
So this is a question from someone online. Does the image of steppe in Russia influence the image of Russia as a big country, important for the imperial imagery? And how is this very image of steppe being spacious, endless, and open space imagined in Ukraine?
Okay, there were two questions there, right? One is, how do Russians, let's do the first question first. It was,
Has the image of steppe in Russia influenced the image of Russia as a big country, important for the imperial imagery?
yes, partly because it's the country that spans Eurasia, 2 continents. There's part of that, but it's also, as it was a main point in the paper, is it's the steppe is that region about which they worry the most, because it really is, the physical geography is borderless. And so since the 17th century, the Russians, the Muscovites to start with, and then the Russians worked on building these bands of sort of defense posts around, of which Belgorod, which is right on the border, it's a 17th century protection against the wild field, because the wild field could produce all sorts of raids and danger for settled populations. But it still hasn't worked, because we had the French and the Poles and the Germans and so on and so forth, who have been very active trying to invade Russia. So big, yes, but also very worrying. How do we, and I think Americans are experiencing a teeny part of that with our border business right now. What do we do with that border? Canada is this sort of friendly English speaking place, and people somehow don't seem to come through the northern border. Why they don't, I'm not sure, but anyway. So okay, that's that. And then the Ukrainians, the question there was,
and how is this very image of steppe being spacious, endless, and open space imagined in Ukraine?
So that's an important point, and it's not. That's what's interesting about the Ukrainian situation. It's not liminal until the Russians made it liminal. It's not. It's our home. It's where we live. It's where we farm. It's where we have our. One of the poems that I was dealing with talks about, this cliche that Russians don't really want to think about big political things. They want their homes, their farms, their sort of specific community, and they want to live. So it's not by chance that that Ukrainians can come to our prairie and find these settled homes and farms and so forth and feel right at home, because that's what, I don't think we Americans in 2024 think of the prairie as being liminal. Certainly in the 19th century, that was the case. As you know, we did incredibly arrogant things like buy the Louisiana Purchase and chase out Indians, and you know, and then we don't need to go there, but so Ukrainians, it's become liminal because Russians made it liminal, particularly that eastern piece that Catherine called New Russia, and the border, the coast on the sort of on the Black Sea as well.
So we've got one last comment here, I think, and then we're going to close in about 2 minutes time as we're running late.
Okay, I'll try and make it a good one. Okay, I just wanted to sound a note of caution about this Steppe relationship thing, because I think it's in danger of reinforcing a key narrative of Russian neo-imperialism, which is the idea of paternalism, that kind of the Russian mother or father is either protecting or saving or disciplining this wayward Ukrainian child. And I just wanted to kind of come at it from a bit of an international relations perspective, which is to say that actually that's might not be what's going on, because often how Ukraine and other areas are being understood is as a buffer zone, right?
That's what I said. Yeah.
They're there to be sacrificed, right? So it's an absence of that emotional relationships. There's an absence of care, and the only emotion that you're seeing there is kind of threat, self-protection. So yeah, I just wanted to flag that up as something, you know, that's slightly problematic.
That I mean, that's fair, and you know, when one doesn't want to create too many kinship metaphors, but I think they do play a role. And another thing that's very important to realize, I mean, even starting with the late 17th, 18th century, Ukraine has been a fountainhead, a source of creative energy, and of kind of a little sort of unbuckled, freer thinking, if you will. And in the Soviet era, a major source of leadership. I mean, it's amazing that two of the leaders in the post-Stalin era, Khrushchev and Brezhnev, were Russian-speaking Ukrainians. So once Russia has co-opted that population, sure, they're very happy to draw on the human potential of Ukrainians. And, you know, just go read sometime if you have the chance, Chekhov's story, The Man in the Case. It's a brilliant sort of psychological, cultural juxtaposition of very cosseted, sort of demagogic Russian thinking. And of course, these are gross generalizations, but then there's Chekhov, and much free-forming Ukrainian thinking that I won't say anymore, but go read that story. It's wonderful.
Well, thank you, Edith, for a really expert reflection and testimony on the place of the East. And thank you all for coming to this morning's symposium. We're going to close now and reopen again at 2 o'clock. So